So welcome everybody. It's a great opportunity today to have this conversation with Chris Ives. Chris is going to introduce himself. What I can say about Chris is that he's a good guy and he will take from here. So I'll pass the ball on to Chris, and we're very, very excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you because I know you've been thinking about a lot of things I've been thinking about. But anyway, thank you, Piero. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I realize it's Good Friday. And I bet, Piero, even though maybe some of the people, the 70 people, may not be highly observant Christians, a lot of people probably got most of today off. So maybe it's the beginning of a 3-day weekend or partway into one. But yeah, it's quality, not quantity. But thank you, everybody. And maybe what I'll do is just say a few things about myself so you know who I am. As you may know, I'm working on a book right now about Buddhism and the climate crisis, and I'll be reworking that this summer and probably publishing that with Wisdom Publications. And maybe what I'll do is share a few things about that so you can get a sense of what I'm thinking about. And then, we should have a good 35, 40 minutes just to talk about this, see what you've been thinking about, certain practices, certain challenges, and we can just, be in dialogue together. I'm not a big PowerPoint kind of guy, but to give you a sense of some of the themes in the book, I do have a small PowerPoint that'll give you a sense of some of these themes. And here late in the day, it might make it easier to kind of drill down and catch what I'm saying here on a Friday evening. But anyway, yeah, I teach at Stonehill College, which is a college south of Boston. And I also teach at the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies. I'm a member of the board of directors there. And my main involvement with Buddhism has been primarily Zen Buddhism. When I was an undergraduate about 50 years ago, I started sitting Zazen and went off to Japan to practice Zen and spent 5 years there working as an English teacher for the visa and the income and all, and practicing in one of the monasteries in Kyoto, and then came back to the US, followed a Japanese Zen Buddhist philosopher to Claremont Graduate School outside Los Angeles, and then got my doctorate there and taught for a number of years at University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, and then met a woman in Boston who's now my wife back in 1998 and moved back east and started teaching at Stonehill. Most of my scholarly work has been on Zen and ethics, especially modern Zen and ethics, and most recently looking at Buddhism, nature, and environmental ethics. And so the book I'm working on now, it's not going to be heavily academic like that Zen on the Trail book. It'll be more kind of personable, accessible and all. So let me see if I can share my screen here and do this old. So let me just share a few things about the book. As some of you know, when people started writing about Buddhism and ecological questions 20, 25 years ago, sort of the low-hanging fruit that a lot of people zeroed in on was consumerism, on the assumption that, consumerism in this country and other places, has a huge ecological footprint, and that might be, the place to go to start. And so we have these 2 volumes you may be familiar with. And it is sort of low-hanging fruit when you think about the Buddhist critique of desire and how desire is totally implicated in consumerism, the desire for the newest thing or something bigger than your neighbor. And so it's not surprising that people, zero in there. And if we think about, okay, so what is this consumerism thing? We could think of it as, basically a belief and a set of actions, like every ism. And so in broad strokes, consumerism being a belief that, buying or having certain things or experiences will make a person happy. And then the actions based on that, certain consumer behaviors, buying stuff we don't need, or retail therapy, keeping up with the Joneses, as well as the ascription of high status to those who possess wealth. And I don't know about you guys, but as I thought about this, I'm not sure how many people are actually bought into full-on consumerism. People who really do believe that getting more and more stuff will make me happier. But I think a lot of us are engaged in certain consumer behaviors, maybe buying things we don't need when we're feeling depressed or other things. But I think more importantly, a lot of Buddhists, like I said, come at this because the Buddhists focus on desire. And if we think about, desire or tanha, or greed as one of the three poisons of greed, ill will, and ignorance, these detrimental mental states that cause suffering, we can break greed down into, craving and clinging. So craving for things or situations we don't have, or clinging to things and situations we do, in a sense, have. Obviously, here we're talking about attachment. And when I thought about this, I don't know that many of us have that full-blown desire for more stuff, but I have a sense that a lot of us are attached to our lifestyle. And in a sense, there could be anxiety or fear about having less. And so maybe if we bring Buddhism to bear on our lifestyle, the issue may be more one of clinging than of craving. In other words, the issue is we lead high impact lifestyles, and even if we're not trying to increase our possessions or buy more and more unneeded stuff, our lifestyle does have a large impact, and we may be very much attached to having, the ability to fly off on certain vacations or drive a certain kind of car or eat certain kinds of food. And obviously this depends on our social class. I mean, obviously there are a lot of people in this country that don't even have the luxury of thinking about a vacation. But suffice that to say, maybe the issue is more materialism attached to material conditions than consumerism as this active greed or desire for more. And so partly what I'm thinking about is materialism, our lifestyle, and its environmental impact is one cause of the climate crisis. Certainly not the only cause, but one cause. The other thing I'm thinking about a lot early on in the manuscript is what hinders our responsiveness. And in addition to, a lot of people in this culture being caught up in material concerns, the amount of freneticism, people being super busy, multitasking, hurrying, juggling things, and distraction, how that affects our ability to pay attention, see what's going on, and respond to it actively. And of course, technology is playing a role here as well in terms of, some of us being distracted by our gadgets or spending too much time, streaming things on our device or whatever. And one thing I'm interested is, this distraction is one form of ignorance. We have the traditional Buddhist discussion of ignorance, usually understood as ignorance of impermanence or ignorance of, what we really are, falling into thinking we are these separate little entities, possibly with some sort of essence or soul, as opposed to realizing how we exist interrelationally. And so one thing I'm doing in the manuscript is thinking about, ignorance and ignorance, and kind of stretching the Buddhist notion of ignorance in a certain way to think about ignorance and the climate crisis. And so if we think about this, it can be total lack of knowledge, being misinformed, really not knowing that it's caused by humans or not knowing the magnitude. Ignorance in the sense of ignoring because we're distracted, because we're always on our devices or social media. Ignorance in the sense of ignoring the problem. I just don't want to deal with it. I'm a busy person, whatever it might be. Or, ignorance or ignorance of our causal responsibility. I'm not responsible for it. I drive, a hybrid. It's the people driving the Hummers or the gas guzzlers. Sometimes ignorance of actions we can take, people being unaware of what we can do, whether it's greening our lifestyle or engaging in activism. Ignorance in the forms of ideas that justify our lifestyle. Jesus is coming back soon and all of this is going to be destroyed. So why worry about sustainability? In some cases, ignorance in the forms of, ideas about certain others. Why should we do anything if, people in China and India with their huge populations are doing certain things? Or, ignorance in terms of ideas about everyone working in the fossil fuel industry being fundamentally evil or corrupted. And then one thing, I know some of you are very interested in this, and we'll come back around to it, ignorance of our embeddedness in nature as nature, ignorance in the form of people feeling disconnected from nature or psychologically, emotionally being disconnected from nature. And let me just keep rolling. I know you may want to comment on this or ask questions, but let me just put this out here and then we can have plenty of time for discussion. And so one question is, what does Buddhism offer as we deal with materialism, our high impact lifestyle, and perhaps our attachment to that, and freneticism and ignorance as a hindrance to responding. So here we're talking about causation and responsiveness. And obviously in terms of freneticism and distraction, and I know many of you with your work with mindfulness and other practices, the need to slow down and pay attention. And one concept I'm playing with here, and I'll say a little bit more about in a second, is spaciousness. And then in terms of our high impact materialistic lifestyle, the whole question of how Buddhism might help us figure out ways to simplify and green our lifestyle. So in terms of the freneticism and distraction as a hindrance to our responsiveness, I'm playing in the manuscript and in my own life and in my own practice, spaciousness in three areas, the three loci or arenas of karma. As I'm sure you know, mental activity is a form of action, speech actions, physical actions, and thinking a little bit about spaciousness in relation to each of those. And so, for example, in terms of mental spaciousness, and obviously there are a lot of ways to think about meditation, mindfulness, what goes on the cushions or in our lives. But in the manuscript, I'm talking about through meditation and other practices, settling down, shifting from thinking, obsessing to more of an open awareness and opening up what you often see in Buddhist texts, Tibetan, Theravadan, Zen, references to sky mind. Here's a quotation from Jack Kornfield attributing this to the Buddha. I haven't been able to find this in any Buddhist sutras. Someday I'll have to ask Jack, I guess. But he says, develop a mind that is vast like space, where experiences both pleasant and unpleasant can appear and disappear without conflict, struggle, or harm. Rest in a mind like vast sky. And what's interesting, a lot of my work with Buddhism as a scholar is through the Japanese language, as I work on Japanese Zen. But the character, the Chinese-Japanese character for sky, is also the character for empty and for space or spaciousness. And so one thing I'm kind of riffing on in the manuscript is sky mind that is, in a certain sense, emptied and spacious like the sky. And here I'm giving you the different pronunciations, kara, ku, and sora, depending on how this character is used or compounds it appears in with other Japanese characters. Another thing I'm working with, and this is also quite relevant to being with the climate crisis, in the midst of our anxiety, our fear, our grief, and the temptation to numb out as a kind of psychic numbing or shut down or ignore it. And one thing I've been working on in both in my scholarly writing and in this manuscript is a Japanese concept, genjo, that's lifted up by Dogen. And you may know Dogen, a 13th century Zen figure in Japan. And he talks about this idea of genjo that I choose to translate as presencing. And we don't need to get into this a lot. We can circle back to this. But in Zen practice, the idea of presencing oneself, being fully present in the present with a kind of presence, and how when we are fully present like that, and some of you may be familiar with sort of the Zen terminology, we can be present and open to appreciate how things in our experience, whether it's the sunset, a tree, a loved one's faith, is presencing itself, is in a sense coming to us in that sort of vibratory suchness, and we are filled with that. And then in sort of grand Zen fashion, reaching a depth where any sense of me being present and that object of experience presencing itself drops away, and it's just reality presencing, boom, this sunset, this music, this hug, whatever that might be, that kind of non-dual experience that Zen is very focused on. But I'm playing with this as a resource for when we think about, in the midst of our fear, anxiety, despair, can we find in ourselves, perhaps through meditation practice, the ability to stay present, to presence ourselves and witness what's going on, even if at the same time feeling rattled by it, how to face the crisis, face reality without panicking or looking away. And in that way, maintain focus, resilience, and maybe even the stamina to hang in there insofar as we may get involved in activism as well. Also, in terms of other types of spaciousness, verbal spaciousness, and I get into the book a bit about, different things that clutter our conversations, whether it's the speaker or the listener not listening or interrupting, and sort of playing again with this idea of presence. How can we be present, listening deeply, and perhaps that being a resource for hearing across divides, especially around the climate crisis, finding common ground and finding an ability to build solidarity and community. And then also thinking about in our personal lives, physical spaciousness, whether it's our bodies moving through time, how we schedule our days, what we do, and also spatial spaciousness in terms of our surroundings. And that too is a resource for helping us free up our attention, our time, space in our lives, to keep an eye on the ball and respond to ecological crises. Also, shifting now from, how Buddhism might help us deal with that freneticism in terms of dealing with our high impact lifestyle. In some ways, and some of you may have tapped some of these resources for, reworking our lifestyle in a way that is simpler and lower impact. And Buddhism offers, as you know, all sorts of mental states. Some of them, for example, are the opposites of the three poisons, wisdom instead of ignorance, generosity instead of greed, loving kindness as opposed to ill will or anger, and a whole variety of other, wholesome or healthy mental states. We could even call these, in a sense, virtues. And so I'm playing with some of these, and maybe, we can share, maybe some of you are as well, these values and virtues, mainly mental states like restraint, simplicity, contentment, and you have the list there. I won't just read down it. We can circle back down to this later, but I'm working with, how do we put these into practice? Because in some ways, when you think about it, the Buddhist spiritual path, at least in early Buddhism, though it was really about, purifying our minds of greed, ill will, and ignorance in a monastic setting, more often than not, is also a very ecological way of living. It's kind of a win-win thing. And of course, 2,500 years ago, this wasn't created as a spiritual path with ecological benefits. It was straight up dealing with suffering. But it's interesting how it also lends itself without much modification as a template or a model, a value system for living simply. The other thing is I start moving up, the book kind of moves in concentric circles, starting with, us, our mind, our speech, our bodily actions, and then thinking about, what is our support structure? A lot of us are lay people. We don't live in monasteries with, a regimen, guidelines, a strictly controlled life. But how, in some ways, for me at least, Zen monasticism can provide a template for a way of sort of setting up our homes, our space, our routines, saying grace during meals, being mindful around different tasks as meditation rather than just chores, a place to sit, maybe an altar. And so I'm playing with, this idea of home monastery. Zen monastery as a template for setting up our home. And then going out into another concentric circle, and I know this will tie into a lot of your interests, is how our home, our place, involves living embedded in nature in one's specific place. And as I said earlier, one form of ignorance that is relevant to the climate crisis is our sense of being separate from nature, not realizing how we exist in this energy field, in Thich Nhat Hanh's, interbeing, what traditional Buddhism would call dependent arising, or just simply nature. And as you all know, and it's not just Zen, Buddhism offers a variety of practices for helping us realize our embeddedness in nature as nature. And I know that several of you, and on one of your videos today, Piero, I heard you using language very similar to this, and in terms of some of your teachings and workshops, helping people realize out in nature that they are nature. They're not just in nature as something separate observing. And here I'm thinking of realizing in two senses: realize in terms of awaken to this fact, and also realize in the sense of actualizing it, really bringing it forward, putting it into action in our bodies, in our embodiedness, as a way to realize or actualize the fact that we're embedded in nature. One thing I've been playing with is how our embodiedness, in a way, is our gateway to realizing our embeddedness in nature. And in that way, overcome our felt sense of separation. And yeah, come to appreciate, value, and by extension, care for nature more. In conjunction with this, a little more broadly, some of you may be familiar with poet Gary Snyder's writings, not just his poetry, but he talks a lot about re-inhabitation. How can we be in a place, in a watershed, in a bioregion, and really tune ourselves, partly through education, to the hydrological cycles, the geology of the place, the natural history, the history with indigenous peoples, and European settler colonialism in this place, and really plug into the place and steward it, and even get involved in local zoning boards and the mundane political aspect of being committed to one's place. Now, a lot of what I've been talking about is really about getting our act together pretty much individually in terms of our impact, our distraction. And that is important as a foundation, I would say, and we'll get to this in a second, for not only staying present to what's happening, avoiding numbing out or just distracting ourselves, but also taking action. But if we only look at materialism and this freneticism, is to focus on the individual and overlook another factor here, perhaps in many ways a larger factor, which is powerful actors, institutions, structures, systems, economic models. I know Piero, you and David Lloyd does this as well, talks a lot about the growth model of economics, and looking at these larger structures that cause or exacerbate problems like the climate crisis. In other words, I think what we need to do, not just as Buddhists, but as people that care, is focus not only on lifestyle change, but also on structural change. Otherwise we run the risk of blaming individual consumers, like, yeah, the planet is ruined because of consumerism and greedy Americans, and not dealing with larger causes of environmental issues, whether it's subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, the lack of meaningful campaign finance reform. We can go on and on and on about that, as maybe some of you have done on your own. And so moving from the individual to the structural change, a lot of what we're talking about here is community, like the community you all have created with Piero's guidance, and what we're doing right here, right now. Now, Gary Snyder and Bill McKibben in his writings, really talk about building local communities, in a place, or in some cases, yeah, there's a role for online communities like yours. And so what we're doing here are the dangerous times ecosattvas that get together through Zoom. And this often gets into expanded notions of Sangha, new forms of Sangha. Gary Snyder talks about great earth Sangha, that is not just humans, but other sentient beings like animals. And so then the question is, as I said earlier, I think the low-hanging fruit for Buddhism is lifestyle change. The traditional Buddhist approach is ecological. It has a lot to say about desire. It gives us a lot of pointers for simple, low-impact living. But how, equipped is the tradition to go beyond its analysis of our lifestyle, our desire, our way of living, and grapple with these larger structural issues, social, political, and economic? Historically, does it offer examples, or in terms of Buddhist doctrines, practices, and values, does it give us resources for speaking truth to power, for being fully energized and engaged as activists? In many ways, historically, and if you want to look at this further, we can. I do it a bit in the book. There are a lot of things in traditional Buddhism that have undermined speaking truth to power, getting involved in social justice movements, kind of challenging the status quo. As I think many of you know, David Loy has gotten into some of that in some of his writings, like in the Eco Dharma book. He's talking about how early on nirvana was seen as transcendent of all of this down here, or liberation is often understood in individual terms rather than looking at collective suffering, collective liberation. And there are a lot of other facets of Buddhism we could discuss. And again, we could circle back to that. But I think, even though Buddhism hasn't really been, involved in social justice activism historically, especially in Japan, but in other Buddhist countries around the world, as you may know, in Asia especially, Buddhism has often had a very symbiotic, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back relationship with the powers that be. And that has undermined Buddhist activism, around changing the status quo or whatever. But, here I just list a few reasons where, yeah, you can find a Buddhist rationale for activism, for pushing people beyond the cushions, beyond their individual meditation practice, to getting involved. Traditional notions of suffering, it's not just the main psychological anguish that many of us look at when we think about Buddhist suffering, but physical suffering is included in traditional Buddhist texts. Buddhist texts talk about how that sort of universal existential suffering can be shaped by or exacerbated by social conditions. Pursuing the path is not divorced from that. Implied duties to take action, especially in things like the Bodhisattva, that ideal in Mahayana Buddhism, taking vows to help people. And activism, benefits the person, at least in terms of your path. As many of you may know, if you've been involved in community groups or protesting, letter writing, any kind of activism, there are certain things that benefit the activist, having a mirror on ourselves, generating generosity and compassion, and several other things that I list here, including overcoming, I say, inertia, doubts, despair. In addition to the 3 poisons, I imagine a lot of you are familiar with the 5 hindrances, which in addition to greed, ill will, and ignorance, also include sloth and doubt and mental agitation, some of the things that are relevant to being involved in activism. Stephanie Kazi, may be familiar with her. She has a piece in this edited volume in the bottom, edited by Chris Queen, who's the brother of Bethany, Dan Kozort's wife. And basically, talking about different ways Buddhism can support activism. And then the question for us is, getting engaged in activism, what can we do at these various levels, local, regional, national, and international? And in part of the book, I do get into sharing some ideas, again, about what Buddhism may be able to offer at those levels. So anyway, let me just stop there. And let me just confirm the screen sharing has stopped, right, Piero?
Yeah.
All right, we're back to gallery view. So
We are.
I know that was a lot, but I'd be curious to hear what you all have been thinking about. You're drawing from Buddhism to think about the climate crisis, how we might respond, how we might green our lifestyle. So let me just stop and let's have some time to talk.